Look, this is a really basic geology talk, so if there's any geologists in the room, can you leave? and I suppose trying to link them with some of the soils that you see. And I did a lot of soil mapping on Eyre Peninsula, I suppose, back in the 80s and 90s last century. And in some ways, yeah, a lot of the surface geology is reasonably similar to that. And occasionally I'll start calling it the wrong term, but it's just... So the two things I was just going to talk about was the river terraces, and we drove through one of those between sort of Berry and here. And I suppose the thing about the river terraces, which for me is quite unique, is there's actually young soils in there, which most of South Australia we don't have young soils. And you do have, I suppose, quite young deposits, the old levee banks and things that are considered less than 4,000 years old. Cunambidual formation is really the clay that you see, and anyone that's worked in the swamps around here, you start getting those really clay soils. You're in that formation. It's around about 4,000 years ago. So, and underneath that you find there's a lot of coarse sandy materials, which is considered, say, around 10,000. And if you actually think of that process, it's really the sea level dropped. So as the river was flowing through, you had all this coarser stuff, and the sea level come up, you started getting the fine material sitting over the top of that, so more of it like a lake deposit. And so that's why you've got this coarse stuff, and on top you've got this fine material sitting over that. And there are the odd little dune and a few other things in that, but so some, I haven't really got some of the examples, this grey and brown clays, which are really common through a lot of the floodplain areas, and then these little patches of sand that you might see. But often the clays in that, the horizons aren't as well developed as what you'd sort of see in clay soils in other parts of the state, because they're fairly young soils, relatively speaking. The other one I'll just briefly mention is really linked to the Loxton land system, which really runs through this area, sort of out to the east of Loxton and up sort of, I suppose, on the east side, up sort of past Berry and further north towards Paringa and sort of up that way. And really commonly, I suppose, the area that's been developed for a lot of the horticulture. And I suppose the land system really is a discontinuous system of parallel dunes. So there are dunes there, but they're not continuous all the way through like you do and see in some areas. They sort of come and go a bit over sort of a rolling terrain with some depressions. And these are actually from Ken Weatherby's soil description book from about 1950 something. And I suppose the basic geology of this, and I've gone from youngest to oldest, which I suppose is probably not the right way of doing it, but so the youngest formation in that is I suppose the latest version of the sandhills, and the Molyneux sand is the whiter one or yellower one, and the, I suppose, slightly redder sand they get through here in places is considered the bunyip sand. So that's sort of around that 10,000 years, and they've formed over a period of time just from local materials and been blown around a bit. So underneath that, I suppose, is what we'd call Riverland formation, and this is where a lot of that calcareous material sits in the layers, and I suppose the calcareous loams and these types of soils that you do see some of that material often sitting there. And they talk about this Loveday soil, which I'll show an example of, which really means it's a soil that's got a bit of a loose calcrete, and underneath you get a lot of fine white calcrete underneath that, and it's quite a sort of soil that you see quite a bit. Underneath that, I suppose, hundreds of thousands of years old, is what they call things like Bacara calcrete. So Bacara is still, all these three here are basically formed by wind, so the material that's blown in over the top of the landscape. And Bacara is a hard calcrete that's been exposed, gone hard, and then things have formed over the top of that as well. And you can normally tell it because it's more of a laminar calcrete, much harder to sort of dig through or something than the Riverland formation type calcretes, which can get a bit, certainly nodules and lumps in them. But yeah, Bacara much more of a laminar type calcrete, bit like the flora, I suppose. Running through, I suppose, you're then hitting, I suppose, underneath that is Blanchetown clay. And we drove up through from Berry, and as we sort of just came up the edge of that escarpment on the left, there's a whole lump of red clay sticking out. And if you look around any of the cliffs, you often find these bits of Blanchetown clay up quite high in the landscape, and it's quite a red sort of clay that you'll see. Very significant for horticulture. Often I suppose the water tables are often perching on top of that layer, where they get water tables developing in horticultural systems, and it's sort of good and bad. It stops the water going down deeper. It means you can capture it with drainage if there's too much water there, but it also, it can cause perched water tables as well. And And basically where it's intermittent, but where it's present, it stops sort of drainage through that profile. So often those soils above that can have an issue with salt and boron sitting in the layers above that. Underneath that, Loxton Perilla sands, getting into more marine origin type process that you can see in the cliffs of the river in places, and sort of Mannum limestone being again under the sea. I probably missed a few out there, but a simple version of geology. I don't know, any geologists here? No, that's good. And just when you relate that, I suppose, so the landscape we're about to go to, so you get these sort of sandy lumps up the top. Underneath is what we call Riverland formation, sort of undulating sort of landscape, common on Upper Eyre Peninsula as well. May have this hard calcrete layer I talked about, sort of, Ripon or Bacara calcrete sitting in there. Again, they're not always present. Going down further, this red impermeable clay, red or can go a bit green at times, what we call Blanchetown clay. Very common across South Australia. You can find patches of it in the cliffs at Ceduna, around Kimber, in the mid-north in patches as well. So it was more of a sort of lake type clay, I suppose, that formed when periods where things were a lot wetter, and then you're getting to these tertiary sediments, so the Loxton Perilla sands and some of these old limestones have been under the sea. And how that relates to soils, so here's an example of a sort of deep sandy soil, so that's one of those Molyneux sand or Bunyip sand, I suppose, if it's a bit redder. You then get some sand over clays or these sort of little clay layers underneath them. Someone asked me about whether that was Callabonna clay. This is what you'd call Callabonna clay, that younger clay, but don't worry, I didn't explain that in my notes, I didn't put that in here. Running through to, I suppose, this typical profile, which is very characteristics of sort of mallee calcareous soils, where you get this bit of rubble around that 40 centimetres, this fine material underneath. So that's what's called Riverland formation, or the Loveday soil type. And but yeah, common in sort of swales, I suppose. Moving through to some of the really hard calcrete, where underneath here you've got, you know, almost impermeable calcrete, I suppose, down the bottom of that one, which is linked to Bacara calcrete. Similar thing on this soil, underneath that soil type is hitting the calcrete, so some of those other layers are missing. And then I suppose the last one, which is a heavier version, what I really want to point out, this one you've got a lime layer in here, but you're actually picking up the Blanchetown clay, you know, just a bit under a metre deep. You know, there's a really dense sort of clay layer, and that's an example of Blanchetown coming in quite shallow in the soil. So I suppose, and certainly any of you that have done, we've got soil surveys and things, some of these things, yeah, the soil surveyors would have picked those up in some of their descriptions. The other thing they would have possibly described is the carbonate classes. And, you know, there's a number, this is a fine carbonate in clay. This is the sheet or lamina type calcrete of the Ripon Bacara. And then you've got these versions, I suppose, of these class 3B, 3A, 3, which is that same Riverland soil. So you've got different amounts of I suppose, the lumpy stuff over some fine white material. And then I suppose this is on the deep sand, you can get a little bit of carbon in that. So actually they are, I suppose, through described under certain classes from class 1 through to 4. And from perennial crops, I suppose, what we find is, you know, the drainage is often a bit poorer in these ones, and they're not quite as good for root growth. Similar, I suppose, with these ones. These ones actually normally pretty good drainage and good root growth through them, even though they've got more sort of loose rock in them. So they have been used a little bit by soil surveyors to really to delineate how deep perennial crops can go in this landscape.